After the tune, unpacking primate eponyms and what it means for decolonizing science with Duke University's Dr. Elaine Guevara.
Evolution,
communication,
cognition,
conservation,
behavior,
primatology,
typically primates.
Become the monkey.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on the PrimateCast, our attempt to share the experiences and stories of the many people and personalities working in primatology, biological anthropology, and more generally the fields of wildlife science and evolution. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh from Kyoto University's Wildlife Research Center, and this program is brought to you by our Center for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology, known as CICASP, at Kyoto University's Center for the Evolutionary Origins of Human Behavior. Now, in this episode, I talked to Dr. Elaine Guevara about how primates get their names. Elaine is lecturer in evolutionary anthropology in Duke University's Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, and in 2021, she and some colleagues published a study in the International Journal of Primatology called Whom Do Primate Names Honor? Rethinking Primate Eponyms. For those of you who are unsure about that term, an eponym is a name taken or presumably taken from those of people or groups of people, real or fictitious, and often, but not always, as Elaine describes in the interview, as an honorific. In the article, Elaine and her colleagues tackle the colonial roots of primatology, describe where primate eponyms come from, and generally ask whether better ways exist to name the species we all study and love, including what to do about the names that already exist. We dive pretty deep into primate names here, but also how eponyms fit into a much larger picture of our collective colonial past and its influence not only on our science, but our lives in modern society much more generally. Along the way, she explains why some names seem more problematic than others. So, for example, we get to the Véro-Shifak, which gets its name from 19th century French natural history collector Jules Verreau, who engaged in some pretty egregious acts in his time. Or Diane's tarsier, named after Dian Fossey, an iconic primatologist who inspired generations and even had a feature film depict her story, but one that used reprehensible tactics against the local inhabitants of Rwanda to enforce guerrilla conservation. We end the interview with a discussion of where to go from here, what the surveyed primatological community thinks we should do, and how we all need to do our part to practice having these complicated discussions and work toward more and more inclusivity in science and primatology, and indeed in our daily lives. I had a great time during the conversation. I admit that it was awkward at some points because these are difficult conversations to have, but I'm really grateful to have been given the chance to talk about such important ideas with Elaine. When I saw this paper come out last year and then fortuitously met Elaine at this the past summer's Congress of the American Society of Primatologists meeting in Denver, I really knew automatically that I wanted to share this story here with all of you. So I hope you get as much out of it as I did and maybe find ways to talk about scientific names or just generally terms or other concepts and ideas, specifically where they come from in the context of inclusivity within our circles that matter to you most. I'd also like to ask you to check out the links in the show notes to the article that we discussed, but also to the Primate Eponyms website, where you can learn more about the etymologies and people behind primate names, and even contribute if you have information about yours. I've also linked you to a survey that Elaine's group is running to hear more voices from the primatological community and better understand how we collectively think naming should progress, and whether deeper change of our existing names and system is needed. So please click on that link and share your own thoughts with them. Right, without further preamble, here is my interview with Dr. Elaine Guevara on primate eponyms. So Elaine, the main reason I asked you to join us on the podcast is because as we met in Denver at the American Society of Primatology meetings this summer, I thought it was really cool, this study that you worked on with some colleagues and published in the International Journal of Primatology recently about primate eponyms. And so we're going to put links in the show notes for this episode to the article and the website, the Primate Eponyms website, so people can go and check that out and hopefully add their own information about their own favorite primates.
Yes, please do.
Origin and etymology of the name. But Before we get into eponyms, maybe I can just ask you a very basic question. I think most of our listeners will already be aware of how scientific naming works, but maybe you could just talk briefly about how organisms get their names.
Right. Yeah. So it's, perhaps sort of a surprisingly unsystematic process when you really think about it, which I certainly hadn't until fairly recently. But basically, whoever, quote, discovers, end quote, a species, so that is whoever identifies an organism that they think represents a novel species that has not already been described in the scientific literature, and then they describe it in the scientific literature. That person, and nowadays, given that science is so collaborative, it's almost certainly going to be multiple people, but they will name the species. They'll propose a name for it, and they pretty much have the right to name the species however they see fit. And so then once a species is named, the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature keeps track of and governs those names. And so I am not a taxonomist, to be clear, and the ICZN, I don't know, much about it. Most of what I've learned has come from working on this project. And some of our other team members know a lot more about it. But from what I understand, this is essentially an 18th century body that was established to sort of create some guidelines or really rules for how species are named, and really just ensuring that each species has a single recognized binomial, that there's a standard name for each species. And so binomial, that's that genus and species name. So Homo sapiens, that two-word name, often called the scientific name or the Linnaean name. And so there was sort of a problem with a lot of synonyms or species having multiple names out in the literature. That's very confusing. And so, of course, the Linnaean name dates several centuries back to Linnaeus, who named tons of species, by far, the person who's bestowed the most of these names. This body was formed to sort of address the proliferation of synonyms and sort of bring some standardization to names. And so it just persists through today. And although it's ostensibly an international organization, I'll note that, I've looked at their website and they have around 30 commissioners, and they're nearly all from the global north, right? So the lion's share are European, and then about another quarter are from Anglophone North America.
Right. In preparation for this interview, I kind of dug a little bit into, we'll get to this later, but some of the species I've worked with and thinking about how names are formed. But you're right that it seems like when we think of it, it feels kind of static, these scientific names for species. Maybe now because a lot of the organisms we study have already been described, certainly not all, but at least we've had a lot of practice in how things are named and kind of what standards are out there. Whereas maybe a few hundred years ago, when a lot of these things were being named, such standards didn't exist. So it's a much more dynamic process, at least historically, than maybe a lot of us might think of.
Yeah, and I will just say, I don't know if this is putting the cart before the horse or whatever, but I'm sure this will come up, and there's a real value to stability. But taxonomy just isn't stable, and especially in primatology. I mean, there have been so many subspecies elevations and species differently delimited, over the last few decades. So when I go through the literature at various points in my research career, it can be confusing to figure out, like, okay, I'll talk about the species I study, Propithecus varroa or varroa that used to refer to all the species on the western half of Madagascar. So that is now like 5 different species. So when you go back, you can be confused about which one they're talking about because these are now considered different species. They've been elevated. So those sorts of changes are happening and confusing people all the time. Subspecies were in vogue for a while, and they're sort of gone out of favor nowadays.
So the article that we'll be talking about, at least now, whom do primate names honor? Rethinking primate eponyms. This idea of eponyms, not just specific to primates, but that's so names that are taken or thought to be taken from people or groups of people. They could be real or fictitious. That's kind of like a website definition of the term eponym. But so thinking about primates specifically, how do they what are they typically named after, or how are the names typically generated? Like, what are they supposed to indicate? So eponyms, obviously being one of them, could be named after people. Right. But what are some of the other?
There's a lot of different things that primates are named after. So we'll get into this, but we found about 25% of primates have eponymous names or eponyms. But there are also morphonyms are really common in primates. So these are names that reflect an aspect of the species morphology. So like red-cheeked mangabey, tons of morphonyms. And toponyms are things like eastern lowland gorilla, which reflect an aspect of geography. And I just realized I'm conflating sort of the common and the scientific name. So we'll kind of get into that. But every species has, the scientific binomial, and then species also have a common name, which is, for us at least, an English name that is sort of the standard recognized non-Latin name. And I would say in primatology, we're pretty fond of common names. So that's something I've noticed kind of varies across different fields of biology, how much people tend to use the scientific versus common names. So especially if you work with lab people, they're always talking about Drosophila and C. elegans, and those are the scientific names. But we usually, my feeling is we usually use the common names of primate species. So that was something we were interested in as well.
That is super interesting. I hadn't really thought of that before, but now that you mention it, for sure, like Drosophila or C. elegans, they obviously have common names, fruit flies, and sometimes it's called the worm. It's an incredible model organism. But is that something you notice, not maybe just a lab field distinction, but are there other kind of fields of animal studies that you've seen that where maybe people are more or less likely to use the scientific, and maybe that's depending on who you're talking to. So if you're talking to other scientists versus if you're talking to, someone in your friend group or.
Yeah, I don't have data about that. So just be data, right? So I think there's just sort of different norms in different fields. I don't think it's just a lab versus field thing. I think, some fields really do use the scientific versus common names more. Maybe when you get into genera with just huge numbers of species, it's like hard to keep track of all the common names. I don't know. Yeah. But I used to work in entomology, and I feel like we used the scientific names for insects a lot. But that might have been the setting. And then one thing I've noticed a lot in working in lemurs is we have a very particular way to refer to lemurs, which is to just say the species epithet. So that is right. Second name in the binomial. So it would be sapiens for Homo sapiens. And, aside from a very popular book, you don't usually hear sapiens being used to refer to humans, but it's very common in the lemur world to talk about cata to mean lemur cat, or talk about rubrivener to mean red-bellied lemurs, which is Eulemur rubrivener. But people talk about, flavifrons or Edwardsi, and people just use the species of them. That's the only group of species that I know that we do this. But it's very common in lemurs, and I don't know why, except for that, there has been generic revisions within the lemurids. I don't know why we really do that, but if you're with lemur people, they'll be using those names.
Yeah, so if you're trying to eavesdrop on this conversation, you need some kind of decoder in order to understand what anyone's talking about. It reminded me too that in Japan here, because so common names could be typically used for things, but when you're talking to people who come from different backgrounds and use different languages, the common names, they might be the same thing, but they will have their own language orientation. So, this happened to me as a a doctoral candidate here, I'd be studying Japanese macaques in the forest, and we need to know all of the trees that they're interacting with and feeding on and things like that. And of course, they have common names in Japan, which I could learn. They have common names in English, which, to be honest with you, I know the common names in Japanese much better than I do in English. But when we talk with people, it would usually be just the scientific names, because that was where we had the common ground. So that's maybe another interesting context where people would mix it up.
Yeah, certainly. That makes a lot of sense.
All right. So this idea of primate eponyms. So you have this really nice kind of figure table combination in the article, which again, we'll link to in the show notes, but looking at the prevalence of primate eponyms. And I think the thing that really jumps out for anybody who's going to look at this is that there's this bright green section, which reflects that the vast majority of these eponyms are global north colonial era people. So do you want to maybe just talk about that a little bit? What does that mean?
We found that it varied across when you're looking at common name or scientific name, but that over 94% across categories of the people honored by eponyms were from the global north. So we call these people namesakes. And I should say, not all eponyms are not inherently honorific, but they often are. So they're usually bestowed to honor someone for their good deeds or contributions, right? And so that's certainly the case in taxonomy. And so, yes, most of the people, I think it's fair to say, honored or commemorated by these names are from the global north. And that is really striking in primates in particular. And we can talk about, comparisons with other taxonomic groups, but primates are essentially a tropical mammalian order. Of course, you're in Japan and there are exceptions, but most primates are in the tropics, or at least they have been, since the Miocene. They are the overlap with where primatologists, at least the ones being honored in these names, it's very little overlap. So I think that makes it particularly striking. And so some people have argued that because eponyms tend to be honorific, they're kind of like verbal or linguistic monuments, right? So they are a way to commemorate a person, and that kind of becomes part of the environment, part of the milieu of whatever the context of its use is. So in this case, in primatology. And I'm certainly open to people pushing back on that idea. I think it's true in a lot of ways. I often think about place names. I'm here in North Carolina, which is named after King Charles. I used to live in Washington, D.C., which has two eponyms in it. So George Washington and Christopher Columbus is the C. In, America, which is named after America Vespucci. So a lot eponyms are extremely ubiquitous in the English-speaking world. And I do think, when we use these names, especially because these places had names before, right? It is sort of perpetuating this sort of erasure of pre-colonial times and memorializing settler colonialism. And I think we can see a similar dynamic in primate names. That said, I didn't know who Vroshafak was until... I didn't know who the species I was studying was named for until, 3 or 4 years ago. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. And so you might comment on that. I find that a lot of people don't really think about the person's name. They do just sort of think of it as a word. And if they stop, they might think, well, I capitalize it, so it's a proper noun, but they are not really aware of who the species are named for.
Yeah, I think that's really at the heart of the problem, right? I feel like that's just perfect example of this kind of a version of an unconscious bias that we have not to kind of look at or question when we see something like that. And this, I guess the whole context for this study is within the movement of what people call decolonizing science. We have a decolonized primatology movement now. One of the co-authors on the poster version of this study was Jo Setchell, who's the editor-in-chief of International Journal of Primatology, and she's been a big driver of this within our field as well to help us think about decolonizing primatology. But what I really love about this study is it's a great opportunity for all of us to just engage with that side of things and start to think much more deeply. And it also fits the cultural moment really well in how we deal with the fact that a lot of our historical figures, the ones that are visible, right, apart from all of them that are still invisible and still coming forward by the works of people and in their drive to be more inclusive in what has come before us, but at least the visible ones have these troubled kind of relationships too with other parts of our society. And so it is a really important moment. So maybe you could just comment on that from your perspective.
Yeah, so I will say, I forget the exact percentage, but I think about 2/3 of eponyms are people who are named during the colonial era, right? And so there are many primate species that have been named more recently. The vast majority are still from the global north. That has changed in the last couple of decades, where there are more people from what we often call primate range countries being named, but it's still mostly people from the global north. Yeah, I think, right. So I actually can see in my notes, it's 70% of names are people from the colonial era, with the exception of certain taxonomic groups that have really seen a huge amount of taxonomic elevation in the last couple decades. But it's still, a majority in most categories. So I think, that is when people were out exploring, people from the global north exploring the various colonies that either their mother country or other, global north countries were occupying. So that facilitated that. So we can see that legacy to this day. And I think what is especially problematic about it is that these inequities continue, right? So it would be different if in the post-colonial era, we had made a lot of progress in overcoming disparities in who is represented in science, who has resources for conservation, whose views have priority, whose research questions are considered most important, etc. But we haven't. We have a lot of work to do. So I think that would lead some people to argue, well, what's the point of thinking about or fixating on this symbolic gesture? But I think, as you already articulated really nicely, it gets us really thinking about this history, facing the past, shining a light on it. That stage is really important. And I notice that in my teaching, like it's really important for people to understand a little bit about, for example, US history, to understand why it's so important to think about the context of the scientific questions that we ask. So I teach, about human variation. I teach a little bit about eugenics and how it persisted until the 1970s in North Carolina. And I think then it kind of sinks in to people like, oh, this is why there are all these implications about around this research. So that's a whole other issue. But I think names matter. And I think that this is an important conversation. And so I will just give one more example that's sort of not related too closely, but I worked at the American Museum of Natural History. That's when I worked in entomology a while back, and then I attended Yale University for my PhD. Both of them had institutes or labs that were named for the Sackler family, which is well known for being behind the opioid epidemic, essentially. So they were the founders of Purdue Pharma, and they are also well known in the Northeast, in particular, for being philanthropists. So their name is on so many things. You see it everywhere. And the opioid epidemic has impacted my family, and I would feel really upset every time I would see that. And I would, have a physiological response to it, or else I would have to brace myself to see it. And it feels much better now that those names have come down and that there's been a settlement for this harm. And if you are interested in learning more about that, there's a great book and New York article I could potentially link to that talks about how this was not just, a harmless accident. This was really something terrible that this family did. So that's, just one way that I think as a person with privilege and from an elite institution, I can kind of access a sense of how memorializing things that have caused harm historically or personally is really alienating. It's really painful. And I don't want to, presume to know how other people feel about this. I think everyone's going to feel differently and have a different take. But I think, I don't know.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry that you experienced some negative outcomes from that. And thank you for sharing the story. I think it's super relevant. Obviously on a different kind of plane of our existence, right? Like you'd be talking in this about primate eponyms as something that as a professional guild we should be thinking about, but then this is just so much broader. This whole issue is so much broader, and how we deal with those kinds of double sides of people's influences seems really hard. So maybe that's a good place to transition then into Jules Verreau. Because I think when I met you in front of your poster in Denver in the summer, that you did share that story with me. And so maybe this is one of the darker, I don't know, maybe it's one of the darker eponyms that you've come across in the primate naming game.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So who is Jules Verreau? I think that's what you're going to ask. And I will just say, Verreau Shafak is the most fascinating and wonderful and also adorable and beautiful animal. So it is deeply ironic to me that it turns out that its namesake is someone who has a pretty dark story. And so I do want to do a bit of a content warning, I guess. It's almost kind of hard to talk about or find the right words to talk about Jules Verreau that are both not dehumanizing in themselves, but without shying away from the reality of what happened with him. So I should note, he has multiple species named after him, not primates, just the one primate, but he has a variety of birds named after him. He was a very prolific, sort of 19th century collector. And so on the ornithologist sort of encyclopedia of namesakes, they have a content warning on his profile. So I just, I guess want to echo that. But in any case, so yes, he was this French explorer, collector, and taxidermist. And so he would go on a lot of expeditions and collect for well-known European natural history museums, as well as individual wealthy private collectors. And apparently, some of his dioramas are still on display from what I've read. And so he would collect all different kinds of exotic species, prepare them, ship them back to Europe for display and study. But he also trafficked in the remains of humans, of people. So he would dig up graves in the exotic lands where he was traveling. And this was a time when human zoos were a thing in Europe. So people living, as well as human remains of the deceased, would be put on display in a zoo-like setting in places like Paris. And so these supposedly exotic people would draw a fascinated crowd. And so he was sort of, that's the context for what's happening. So the best documented case, which is still not very well documented, involves him in travels to Southern Africa, digging up the remains of a recently buried man. So it was thought that this was in what's now Botswana, but there's some uncertainty about that. But he, under cover of night, I believe, dug up this man's remains, did a sort of basically on the fly taxidermy, and then shipped the remains back to Europe in a crate of animal remains that he had similarly prepared. So obviously, very dehumanizing, and a deed that, we kind of look back on with horror now. And it's really striking because this man's remains also kind of moved from collection to museum to collection. Were actually on display until almost the 21st century. So they were on display ultimately in Spain until 1997. And then they were finally, there's a lot of resistance to efforts to finally remove these remains. I'm not a psychologist, but it's very interesting. And then they were finally repatriated. I mean, maybe they were taken to Botswana and given a formal burial. So that's obviously a good thing, but it's not even really certain if that's where this man came from. So, it just reflects how entirely dehumanizing it is that we don't even really know. And so this isn't the only human remains that were incorporated into Garreau's dioramas and taxidermy work. But yeah, so this was someone who we felt was not a figure that we would want to condone or really, memorialize.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a gruesome story. And just I don't think these days it's hard to find examples like that of historical figures that we've lionized or hero worshipped that have these other sides to them. And I don't know if maybe this is something we can come back to, because I think you also, in more recent work following the article, you've polled the primatological community to see what should we do, and maybe the ornithologists also have other ideas. So we'll get to that later. But I, on the heels of that, being informed about Vero Shifak, I was looking at some of the species that I studied. And so the very first primate that I ever did a scientific study on, excuse me, was the black-handed spider monkey, Ateles geoffroyi, which I actually studied at the Calgary Zoo in Alberta, Canada. And so Ateles geoffroyi was named after Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. So this was a French naturalist who lived in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And actually was a contemporary and colleague of Georges Cuvier as well in the French Natural History Museum. And they did a lot of descriptions and comparative anatomy of different species. He is credited as being kind of maybe the second most influential driver of the field of comparative anatomy after Georges Cuvier. And later was kind of like influential in the coming into existence of Evo Devo. So a really influential figure in science and natural history. And I didn't really do a very deep dive on the guy. So I don't really know if there are any kind of darker aspects of that as well. So, but apart from being involved in the kind of description of various animal species, I think, including some primates, there's not really any connection specifically, I think, between him and, say, where spider monkeys are native to in Central and South America. He also, there's other species that were named after him. There's a Jeffrey's cat. There's a Jeffrey's bat. There's a Jeffrey's tamarin. So kind of like Varro, there's a bunch of other things. Do you know anything else that I'm missing about Geoffroy?
I don't specifically. I could try to quickly open my...
I looked on the Primate Eponyms website and I didn't see him listed on the website, but...
Yeah, no, this just says, 18th to 19th century French naturalist. So,
yeah, but it was interesting, the process anyway, just getting more familiar with some of the people that I mean, whether or not he was involved, that were honored during this process. The other one I wanted to mention before I hand it back to you is that the main primate that I study is the Japanese macaque. And so that's Macaca fuscata. And so this is another thing that maybe you can riff on later, but the common and species names actually have different etymologies. So the Japanese macaque is, I think you earlier called it a toponym.
Yeah.
So this is a geographic kind of reference to Japan, where this monkey is endemic. And then the scientific name, so maybe I won't go too deep into the macaca. I think that's like an African word that is now describing a large genus of Asian monkeys, but that'll come up later with orangutans. But fuscata, I think, comes from the Latin fusco, which means dark or dusky. And so I imagine that this is a physical trait.
Right, a morphonym.
A morphonym. And then I found that fuscata in Latin is actually the feminine version of the word, the noun, or adjective. So I don't know if that has any relevance, but the person who is the authority, Edward Blythe, in an 1875 book called The Catalogue of the Mammals and Birds of Burma, is apparently the person who named fuscata. It had a different genus name at the time, but it was kind of interesting to go through that old document online as well. And it just reminded me that, like, so the Catalogue of the Mammals and Birds of Burma seems to have nothing to do with Japan and the Japanese macaque, but the naming process itself can be so convoluted.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I'm someone who likes etymology in general because I think it's really fun and interesting to learn where words come from. But yeah, this project certainly hasn't all been negative either. I think it is just interesting to learn about these things. But yeah, I have in my notes that macaca is Bantu via Portuguese. And there's a lot of sorts of things like that are sort of a colonial language. Orangutan is sort of an example of that as well. But trying to be taken from a local language, which you could argue shows maybe some attempt to recognize the local precedents. I don't know.
That's important to note that I guess not all of these eponyms are negative things. And maybe sometimes we get into the habit of talking, we've been talking specifically about historical figures here. So Jules Verreau or Geoffroy, but there are other cases that might even be stickier in the sense that they're much more recent. And so one example that you talk about in the article is Diane's tarsier, which is named after Dian Fossey. And obviously Dian Fossey, culturally and scientifically, was a really important figure in primatology. And even now, I mean, still her research center, Karasoki Research Center, is still like a really important place for mountain gorilla study. And she's kind of, with Jane Goodall, like one of the quintessential primatologists. Recently, so maybe you can just comment on what the issue is there as well.
Yeah, so Dian Fossey is complex, right? So she is definitely recognized for her contributions to mountain gorilla conservation and just bringing attention to a popular audience. But she has a pretty clear track record of pretty dehumanizing attitudes and behaviors towards the local people where she worked, so towards local Rwandans. So including referring to them using racial epithets, and then using really inhumane methods to try to disincentivize poaching. So she was known to have kidnapped people, even children, and held people hostage at her camp and inflicted sort of public humiliation and bodily harm on supposed poachers, the people that she detained. So she was basically a vigilante, right? She was operating outside the law in a way that was really unethical and also in total defiance of local sovereignty, right? So I think that itself really demonstrates the continuance into the 20th century of this very colonial attitude of, I can do what I see fit, I know best, I have the right, I have the, wherewithal to do this. So yeah, she, arguably did do a lot for gorillas, but I think that her methods, it's a big question whether the ends justify the means. I would say they don't. And not only that, but I think, that is not a sustainable or effective approach to conservation. I mean, I feel like that's almost an inappropriate way to think about it, but it's so clear that sort of punitive approaches to prioritizing animals over local people is not either acceptable in any way or effective on any kind of time scale. So yeah, I think all those aspects of her, sort of behavior and MO and approach are not things we want to commemorate.
Yeah, they definitely. It's hard to oftentimes talk about these issues, but I think we need more and more practice. So first of all, thank you for letting me also get involved in this and learn how to better talk about these issues. I think
it's great to talk to you about it. And I think, again, that really is the point. I wish, sometimes I notice this dynamic with these conversations where, people point out perhaps an issue and then people get defensive if they haven't also been thinking about that issue. And really, it's just meant to start this conversation. And it's really the attention to these things that's going to make, be transformative, I think. And, I think that gets to another question. I don't want to lead the conversation too much.
Please do.
But I think, it's going to be really hard to assess on a case-by-case or individual basis who warrants sort of commemoration or not, right? Humans are complex. And of course, that's also where we get all these arguments about whether it's monuments or eponyms. The question of, whether we should sort of erase history. And I will say, I think, of course, norms and ethics were different in the past. You think about Thoreau operating in the context of those zoos. He was a man of his times, right? But I also don't really find that argument very compelling, because I do wonder when people make an argument about someone being a person of their times, if that is a way that we are also giving ourselves a pass for not doing better when we know we should today. Because we participate in a lot of things we all know are problematic, but we also feel like they're not our fault because that's what everyone's doing, or that's what the global, political and economic system, it's the path of least resistance, right? But we nevertheless cause harm. So I think, I don't find that argument very compelling. But to circle back to where I was initially going, is that, I think eponyms are, if we zoom out, problematic, even if who they honor is not necessarily someone with a sordid or controversial history, right? So, and I will note that there are some people that I really admire who have been memorialized by eponyms. I mean, Jonas Mouselimer was recently named, and another Mouselimer was named for Alison Jolly. There are some wonderful people commemorated by eponyms, and including more women. So we didn't really mention that, but also the vast majority of eponyms are men, which is striking. So it's 93% of eponyms commemorate men, and that is especially striking just because women tend to be, or have been for quite some time, pretty well represented among primatologists. So that's another striking disparity. The women that there tend to be are like mythical figures and people's wives too, more than women primatologists. Although there's some really interesting exceptions of women explorers during the colonial era. So I learned a lot about that. So it was actually really interesting. But I think, just using eponyms in general is potentially, troubling, because they sort of represent or reflect this worldview, a particular worldview, which sort of I think of as being to do with human dominion over nature. It's almost arguably an imperialist type of worldview. And it's not just that worldview itself is problematic, but it's sort of in contrast to a lot of indigenous worldviews. So as we're thinking about how we can incorporate more indigenous epistemologies and worldviews into primatology, I think that's another argument for abandoning eponyms. So I think, not naming an animal after a person makes sense. I think also that worldview is sort of problematic. It's sort of what's gotten us maybe into the environmental crisis we're in and a lot of these conservation issues that we're trying to potentially combat, right? So I think we can, argue for moving away from eponyms, period, and then kind of obviate that need to censor certain people. And I think that is probably pretty important to shift from a scientific sort of practice and enterprise and a conservation enterprise that is largely for and by global North elites. Because I think traditionally we haven't given a lot of thought to species names because we're not even thinking about who is using or consuming these names outside of our own sphere, right? And that is a fundamental shift, I think, in decolonizing primatology or decolonizing conservation. It's just thinking about this is not an enterprise just for a certain group of people. If we really want it to be inclusive, it needs to not just be on our terms or on the terms of a certain group, by which I mean, sort of how things have already done. Because a lot of people feel like inclusion is great until the people who are being included maybe think differently or don't assimilate into the status quo or mainstream, right? So, this sort of great chain of being, Western historical traditional worldview that I don't think, most Western scientists subscribe, but it is, specific to this Western cultural history. Or thinking about like a nature culture dichotomy, these things are not common to all cultures. So I think that's another reason why, if we want to make a real shift in how we practice science rather than just sort of a minor adjustment, it's really challenging, the way we're thinking. So that may be arguably even more important than these specific individuals. So it's not, just an equity issue to include more researchers and community members. In primatology, I'll also say like it really is, I think, fundamental to the quality of science. And kind of thinking back again to Diane Fossey, it is absolutely crucial to the effectiveness of conservation, the success of conservation efforts. Someone who kind of thinks a lot about primate conservation and studies an endangered species, that's just so salient to me that who gets to decide what the right approach to conservation is just makes really little sense if it doesn't include local people.
Yeah, it's such a great point. So far, we're talking about the namesakes, the eponyms themselves, but also the people giving the names obviously are also fundamentally largely global North. And I think the practice is you're not really supposed to give a species your own name,
right?
but you're definitely more likely to be. It's across the board, probably white male global North. The people who are giving most of the names.
Absolutely. So that's something we've tried to look at in our more recent efforts. So maybe that will get published at some point. It's a little bit hard because we have such long author lists nowadays with species descriptions on publications. So it's really hard to know who is proposing what. But just based on author lists, we can see a shift just in general of more like primate range country authors. But yes, absolutely. Who is going to decide is equally important to who is getting honored. And at the same time, though, again, like I feel like saying this, I'm a bit of a hypocrite because why am I also saying what we should or shouldn't do. Like clearly what we need to do is just have a more inclusive process and hear from people. So that's really what motivated the survey, which you were, sort of alluding to. And that's why we sent out a survey about primate eponyms to, all the sort of major primatological societies in different regions around the world so that we could identify contact information for to see what people thought.
Yeah, so that's a great time to move into that because I did want to get into also those results that you have so far. I assume this is a process that might still be ongoing. Inquiries into the primatological community on what they think, like what could be done. So I just want to give an anecdote here because I think it's really relevant. And when we hear it, it sounds great. So recently, one of my colleagues here at International Center in Kyoto University's Inuyama campus, he published a paper with some colleagues in the US describing a new North American saber-toothed carnivoran. And the species that they gave, Pangurban aegiae is named after not necessarily these things are all relevant to the thing, but a Japanese female paleontologist, vertebrate paleontologist, who made some inways into the study of fossil carnivorans. And so you have a Japanese woman scientist who's kind of honored by this naming. And I think all of us can hear that and be like, yeah, about time, right? So we want to be able to show that there are people who are not white, male, global north, colonial era people who have influenced different fields. But coming back to what you just said is like, it's going to be really hard to kind of police case by case and figure out what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, let alone the fact that so many things come to light. Not to say that we're going to throw this particular scientist under the bus and say later we'll discover horrible things. Obviously, that's not the case. But just the whole idea of how we do that. When I first heard this from my colleague, I thought, well, this is really wonderful. But it also, when you scratch a bit deeper, it's like, well, yeah, what are we supposed to do with it? And then I noticed in your article too, you have the Bemaraha woolly lemur, which has a epithet, so species name Cleesii, which is named after John Cleese. So that superficially seems, comical and kind of good natured. But yeah, the hero worship side of it, the global North white male side of it.
So first of all, John Cleese, I mean, I think there's an argument like naming people that are well known might also bring attention to the species.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that is, but that's an argument you might hear.
Yeah.
And it might be true. I'm just not sure. But one trend we saw in the data that I think was really interesting is in recent years, a larger proportion of species have been named after funders. So not scientists or explorers or collectors or people working in museums at all, but actually for donors, essentially. So if you, look on the, I don't know what color it is on the PDF, but on the poster, it's green. Mm-hmm. So especially in the species epithets, it's actually, I think, more funders now than range country post-colonial scientists. Mm-hmm. So that, I think, there's a strong argument that by honoring funders, we can incentivize support for conservation. So these are typically individuals, families, or even corporations. So there's even some species with the names of companies. But I do wonder if that's short-sighted and what the consequences of that are. So I did want to insert that because I wanted to mention that somewhere. That's one of the shifts we're seeing. And I think it's hard not to, have your stomach drop a bit and seeing that that's actually been a bigger increase than range country honorees. Yeah.
Yeah. So range country honorees, in looking at your data from this poster, when you did the preliminary surveys of primatologists, it looks like, so you have two questions. The first one is, should primate eponyms be replaced? So this seems to be a really important question now that faces all of us is, what do we do with the names that are out there already? And it looks like maybe just over a quarter said that definitely some should be replaced. Maybe that would refer to people like Jules Verreau. But more than half of the respondents actually said that they should to some degree. So at least some, if not all. So is that kind of still the trend as well, that the majority of primatologists do think that we should reconsider some of the names?
Yeah, but I think that is really interesting because I think, yes, it's right about the same percentage. And I don't know what it is exactly now because it's Qualtrics, so updating it is not as simple as me just pushing a button. But it's right about the same as yes, all. So I think a lot of people just anecdotally, when talking to people, they think, oh my gosh, yeah, we should definitely remove some of these people. But then they, I think especially with, even though they're a minority in number, range country scientists and conservationists whose names have been bestowed more recently, maybe people are more familiar with, I think like, well, we would hate to take that away. And I get it, because when I was first thinking about this too, I thought like, oh my gosh, the tide is finally turning and now we're going to say we have to change this. But I think, there's not probably that many species left for it to really achieve anything like equity. And then of course the dynamic with the funders, that trend, and the whole bigger question about who gets to name.
Yeah. The second part of your survey was, what should primate names be based on? And here it looks like, so you mentioned range country folks. So indigenous names was like 15% at the time of this poster presentation. Actually, the pie chart looks a lot more distributed in this case. So there doesn't seem to be a majority. 15% for indigenous names, 17% for morphonyms, 16% for geographic names, 16% for habitat, 14% for diet. So it's really 16% for behavior. So kind of 6 different things that would be competing for what potentially could form the basis of a name of a primate.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's worth noting that question allows people to select as many as they think are worthwhile. So it's not, really like individually people are so divided, but people, I think what this shows are accepting of many different kinds of names. But one thing you can see that stands out is that if you add together most of those, I think it looks like at least 75, if not more, like 85% of them are to do with species attributes, right?
Yes.
So, behavior, diet, habitat, geography, morphology, that's the vast majority of what people think species should be named for.
Yeah.
So that kind of ties into the bird names for birds movement, which is the ornithology movement, to remove eponymous bird names. And I think that's one of their big arguments, is that bird names should tell you something about the species, not something about people. And I'm not making a case for that, but that definitely stood out to me in these results. Indigenous names, I think, there's a strong argument for that. And that was certainly the next biggest category. And I think bigger than some of these individual categories like diet, right? So it's about 15% of people saying that they think indigenous names would make good names. And I think there's a compelling case for that, especially if we want to, include people in conservation efforts. Using the names that they use makes a lot of sense. But I do think there's definitely cases where there could be multiple indigenous names and it could be challenging. Not that it couldn't be a process that could be sorted out, but it might be complicated. So again, I think it goes back to just having the conversation.
That is a really good place to ask something I was about to ask earlier, but about Mayas. So recently there was a paper that came out just days ago in the International Journal of Primatology by Mae Fairbanks and colleagues that was it was really interesting looking at the use of the pronunciation. I'll try it. It hurts me. It pains me to say it this way, but of the orangutan, and something like, 35% of British English speakers, and shockingly, 64% of North American English speakers have anglicized and added this ng to the end of the word, which should be something like, and I'll probably butcher it if you can relate it to the indigenous version, but orangutan, which actually doesn't have a G at the end of that at all. And so this article was really interesting, thinking about how the kind of Anglicization process, and in a way has colonial roots as well, for words that become common vernacular, and even referenced in like Oxford dictionaries, how in themselves are somehow damaging to the kind of origins of where these things are coming from.
I think that's such an interesting case, and I sadly didn't get to do more than skim that paper because I just saw it yesterday, and I did send it out to our group, and I saw that they cited Rubis. So Jane Rubis has made the case to abandon the name orangutan completely and to use mice, which is the Malay term, for the animal. And so orangutan is typically thought to be a portmanteau of two Malay words, orang meaning person and hutan meaning forest. But it doesn't seem that that was ever a name actually used by local people, but instead it was a colonial creation, a sort of concoction rooted in European colonialism. So that's sort of a separate question from the pronunciation.
Yes.
It's just like the plot gets thicker, right? So it just goes to show, I think, one of the characteristics of human language is it changes, right, too. So as anthropologists, we're sort of aware of that. And I think, I did note in the paper, they say that the ending is not necessarily wrong, because it was the way Dutch people were writing the name. So I think early on. So, I mean, it's wrong in the sense of if it came from those words, which we're not even totally sure it did, then that's kind of incorrect. But yeah, I wasn't surprised because orangutan, that's what I always hear people say. So I know it's painful when you're used to saying orangutan, but definitely in the US, I was actually surprised that there was the difference with British English because I wasn't aware of that. Here people, I mean, that's what my students say. That's what everybody says. I think it would be kind of hard to change it. And then, layering on like, what is the actual name, but also the pronunciation. It's definitely a sensitive point for me because I think Shafak has a similar thing where this is the term for this genus Propithecus. Again, this is what I study, and I pronounce the word Shafak. It's spelled Sifaka. But the S, I pronounce like an SH, and I don't pronounce an A on the end. And a lot of Malagasy words, you don't pronounce the final A. So that may be correct, but I am still not clear about how that word is actually pronounced because people who don't know will say Sifaka, right? Because that's what it looks like to an English speaker. And we say Shafaks, plural or Shafak at the Lemur Center here at Duke typically. And then it was really interesting to me because when I went to Madagascar, I found that people said Sifaka or Sifak. And I was like, wow, they're actually pronouncing it. I guess I thought I was trying to pronounce it the Malagasy way. And it turns out I think I was pronouncing it the French way. So the colonial way was trying to not pronounce it how I would pronounce it in English. So now is it Sifak, Sifaka? And then there's this thing about whether some people say Shafaka to mean plural, and some people say Shafaks. It's just, I'm really not sure still, sadly. Need to do a survey about that. So I think, pronunciation is tricky.
It's funny
cool paper, cool conversation. I'm really glad they cited Rubis and mice, because I think that's a really great work on this topic.
Yeah, it really seems to be a quagmire. I mean, here I was on my high horse saying, I can't stand when people say orangutan, but then I might run around saying orangutan, and that could be a horrible colonial version of the name of this actual animal that has nothing to do with the indigenous version. So it seems like that's a really complicated story. So maybe just to kind of turn the page on this conversation, what have the ornithologists specifically decided in terms of going forward and what to do with the existing eponymous names?
So there are a couple things to note about the ornithologists. I think some key differences from primates too that I want to mention. So one is that birds have a much broader geographic distribution, right? They're ubiquitous across all continents. Unlike primates, which are pretty restricted to the tropics. So I don't know, to me, that is an important difference. But ornithologists have made the case that birds shouldn't have humans' names, and they have noted the legacy of settler colonialism in the Americas with the naming of species from the Americas. So they've typically been given the names of, descendants of Euro-American ancestry, right? So rather than indigenous or local names. Another thing, though, is that it's the common names for birds that tend to be eponymous, whereas for primates, we see just as many scientific binomials that are eponymous. So they can just basically start using different common names. And so I think that's happening. And we've seen, this is pretty high profile, the change of the name of the Audubon Society, right? So the Audubon Society is an ornithological society, bird lover society, and named for John Audubon, who was an enslaver and racist. So there's been discussion for years about whether his name should be removed, and it is finally. So there is change happening. But in a way, the bird people have it a little bit easier. So they don't really have to deal with ICZN in the same way that people who would want to revise primate taxonomy would.
I see. So I guess maybe we can just conclude by saying this is a work in progress. And for anybody listening, definitely something to keep in mind as part of this. I guess you could call it an ecosystem of things we need to start keeping in mind about how we can be more inclusive in our science and our practices. And Elaine, thanks so much for sharing that story and that article and its results with us. I hope you and your colleagues continue to do this and push the boundaries for all of us.
Yeah, and I will say, and I think this will probably annoy some of my collaborators, but the ICZN's rules, so they have rules about names, things like precedent, and you're not supposed to be able to change a name without having really specific reasons. But those were not laws of physics, right? They are ultimately an arbitrary set of things that a select group of people decided in the past. And, I already mentioned that taxonomy is pretty dynamic. So we see some changes. One example that just comes to mind that's not related to names at all, but the Lasula monkey was defined on the basis of a photograph, which is not something that's been allowed in the past, right? And there's a discussion about holotypes. How biologically valid are they really? So these are the kind of type specimens. Theoretically, every species needs to have a type specimen. But, species aren't represented by individuals. So there's been a problematization to try to make that into a verb, I guess, of holotypes as well. So I think there's lots of things that can be contested. Not everything is set in stone. We don't want to make changing things too easy, but we are scientists, right? I mean, not to make this exclusive about scientists either, but I do think, hopefully it can reach some people to say, if there's a compelling reason or a better way to do something or a more valid way to do something, we shouldn't either just stick our, heels into the mud or whatever. So I know that some of my colleagues feel differently. So this is a challenging subject. And so, but as you said, it's right. It's the conversation. There's definitely options with revising, common names, or maybe making an effort, or even thinking about what the role of the ICZN is, who should be represented in it, right? So I think, a lot of times changes might seem impossible, and look at how there was years of resistance against changing the name of Audubon, right? But then change can happen. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hopefully getting more of our results out there, continuing conversations with people. I hope that anyone listening who hasn't taken the survey will take it. I realized at ASP, there was not great connectivity in the basement where I was.
Yes.
So hopefully some people will be listening who are at ASP and were like, I will do this later. And then of course, other things came along that they'll go back and take the survey, because that would be great. So thank you so much for taking an interest in this and a great conversation, and for sort of bringing this issue to this platform.
Well, I hope we get out there. We'll put the links to your survey as well in the show notes to this podcast. So definitely anyone listening, go and check that out. And Elaine, thank you so much for being on the PrimateCast. This was really, really interesting discussion.
Yeah, thank you for everything you do, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the PrimateCast. The podcast is hosted and produced by me, Dr. Andrew McIntosh, Senior Scientist for Wildlife Conservation at the Wilder Institute, Calgary Zoo, formerly Associate Professor of Biological Sciences at Kyoto University. Join me for new episodes as often as I can get them out on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Leave a rating or a review of the show to help other listeners find it. Connect with me through our website, theprimatecast.info, or social media on X, Facebook, or Instagram. Feel free to comment, ask questions, suggest future guests, or share whatever else might be on your mind. If you value the show, consider donating or becoming a member. You can do so by visiting theprimatecast.info and clicking on the big yellow Buy Me a Mic button, which takes you to our campaign page. Or you could click on that little heart icon next to the social media links in your podcast player, or on the text link in the show notes. Your support will help cover production costs and is essential to ensure that I can continue to produce quality informational and inspirational interviews with leading figures in the field long into the future.